It's our great pleasure to welcome you for this fourth or fifth, actually I don't remember, session of our 2021 CEFREPA lectures series. As you may know, or as you may not know still, the CEFREPA is a new name for the CEFAS, by which I mean the French Research Center in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Kuwait, where I am, Sana'a, Muscat, and Abu Dhabi, not far away from our colleague today, Abdullah. And our series this year is dedicated to the new approaches of the history and culture of Islam. And our aim is to bring together researchers from Europe and the Gulf to observe current research on such topics and arising debates, both in the academic and the public sphere, in Europe and in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf countries. نرحب بكم في الحلقة الرابعة والخامسة ما بتذكر لسلسلة محاضرة السيفريبا لعام 2021. والسيفريبا هو الاسم الجديد للسيفاس، يعني المركز الفرنسي للأبحاث في شبه الجزيرة العربية. سلسلتنا هذه السنة متركزة على الاتجاهات الجديدة لتاريخ الإسلام والثقافات الإسلامية، ونستهدف جمع باحثين من أوروبا ومن الخليج ومن شبه الجزيرة العربية لرصد الأبحاث الحالية في هذه المواضيع ولرصد النقاشات في إطار الأكاديمي وفي المجتمع. I'm happy to have as our keynote speaker today Dr. Mehdi Azaiez, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at the University Catholique de Louvain, and he holds, if I'm not wrong, a PhD from Aix-Marseille University in Islamic Studies, of course. He is the editor of an outstanding and innovative volume written with 26 scholars from various disciplines and entitled The Qur'an Seminar Commentary, a collaborative study of 50 Quranic passages, which was published in 2016. And it provides an up-to-date survey of recent trends in Quranic studies as applied to the Quran hermeneutics through linguistics, epigraphy, paleography, history, with some inspiring comparison with biblical studies, something which I think Abdullah Garadari is very interested in. And finally, yet importantly, he has a personal website, which I would like to show you, but I think it's on the wrong side, which is full of references, and I find it very exciting, which is mehdiazaiez.org. It's full of resources for the field and even for non-specialists like me and maybe like some of the audience. And I am not only happy, but also honored to have Dr. Abdullah Garadari today as our discussant. He is assistant professor at Khalifa University, and he's quite a unique scholar who holds both a PhD in civil engineering and another one in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Aberdeen, which gives his unusual and challenging features to his research. He is the author of Quranic Hermeneutics Between Science, History, and the Bible, published in 2018, and he shares a deep interest in the comparative study of the Quran with the history of antiquity, biblical studies, and theology. Before we begin, I remind you that the lecture will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the CEFREPA YouTube channel. And from now on, you can use the Zoom conversation window to write down your questions as they come to your mind. We will open your mic at the end of the lecture. And now, I leave the virtual floor to Mehdi and Abdullah.
Thank you so much. Before my thanks, I would like to share my screen. Just a second to be sure that it will be seen. It will be possible for everyone to share the screen. Share my. Is it possible to do it? I think so. Yeah. Sorry, just one moment where my PowerPoint is just here. Yeah, I hope that everyone can see my PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be hosted at the CEFREPA lectures and by this remarkable institution of the CEFREPA, which promote a sustained scientific dialogue between Islamic worlds and Western research on Islamic civilization. it is of great importance to create those bridges between researchers from France, especially, and the different countries and different institutions all around the Middle East. I would like to thank Professor Azaiez, Professor Philippe Petria for organizing this lecture, and our dear friend and colleague and Professor Abdullah Galadari. أشكركم على مساهماتكم وتعاونكم مع عزيز شكر. A warm and welcome thanks. ألف شكرا والسلام عليكم. My presentation today is an overview of the development of Quranic studies in the West, especially in Europe and in the United States over the last 100 years. 30 minutes or maybe 35 minutes will not be enough to go into details, and you will excuse me for this general description, but I hope to raise interesting questions. This presentation will be divided in 4 parts, and you can see in the screen these 4 parts. So the first part will be devoted to the Western attempt to elaborate a critical edition. It will be a question. I will treat it also the question of the revisionist works in the second part, and the third part, I would try to describe what we can call the golden age of Quranic studies. This expression, I borrowed this expression from our dear colleague Gabriel Said Reynolds. And finally, I would like to maybe introduce some hermeneutical reflections and to see how those developments of Quranic studies nowadays can implement a new reflection and maybe a turning point in our way to understand the text of the Quran. I will conclude briefly some hermeneutical issues and reasons for advocating closer collaboration between Islamic and Western universities. So my first part now, a Western attempt to elaborate a critical edition. In the beginning of the 20th century, an article titled "The Strophic Structure of the Quran," written by the eminent Viennese scholar of Arabic poetry, Rudolf Eugen Geyer, emphasizes the urgent necessity to establish a critical edition of the Quran. Yet, a century after Geyer, one thing is obvious. There still does not exist a critical edition of the Quran that would meet the requirements of a rigorous philological analysis. A contrasting situation is observed in the case of academic research on the Bible. As early as 1898, the New Testament benefited from a critical apparatus with the publication of the Ebeacht Nestle Novum Testamentum Graece. Here you have the term, edited by Barbara and Kurt Aland by the Biblical Society of Württemberg. This reference book, which was progressively improved throughout the 20th and the 21st century, remains an important instrument of exegesis today. Being far from having a critical apparatus at its disposal, academic research on the Quran relies heavily on the famous Cairo edition of 1924. The initiative that took upon itself to compose the text, however, had absolutely no ambition of being critical in nature. Under the direction of Muhammad bin Ali al-Husayni al-Haddad, it aimed at unifying the Quranic text by favoring a certain reading of the Quran that would facilitate religious instruction in Egypt. The initiative had strictly pedagogical purposes. As we know, this edition was strictly faithful of one reading of Hafs al-Asim, as well as all other variae lectiones or qira'ah. The accomplished work was appreciated by the best specialists in the West, quickly became the equivalent of an official version of the Quran that was widely distributed throughout the Muslim world. Nevertheless, this undeniable success was not without its consequence. having favored a single reading of the Quran, one reading of the Quran, the Cairo edition had de facto endorsed a theological discourse which even today remains under the illusion that there exists a unique reading or way to read the text of the Quran, which has been unchanged from the moment of its first recording to today. While the Cairo edition had a finality being aloof from philological concerns, the ambition to write a story of the Mus'haf was planned for in the 1930s. Under the leadership of three famous researchers, Godolphe Bertrasse, Arthur Jeffrey, and Otto Pretz, it was decided that a critical apparatus be established in support of the methodical work that followed the meticulous research done on the oldest known manuscripts. The successive and early death of both Bertrasse and Pretz unfortunately put an end to the project. In addition, the alleged destruction of the Munich archives during the Second World War bombardments contributed to the lengthy delay of such an initiative. In reality, the delay proves that the archives housing the famous microfilm collection of Quranic manuscripts were preserved. In fact, they remained in possession of Anton Spitaler for several decades without him ever resuming the project. So I would like to now to move rightly to the revisionist works. So a very historical, brief historical overview of the development of Quranic studies. Since the 70s, numerous books have appeared on the genesis of Islam and its founding book. All these accounts of the Quran's genesis have been based on uncertain grounds, in the absence of a critical edition and against the scientific orientation that is itself considered to be close to narratives recounted by the only Arabic sources. Among these are the significant books of Günter Lühling in 1972, John Wansbrough in 1977, Crone and Cook in 1977, and Neville in 1982. And more recently, the work of Christoph Luxemburg which was published in 2002. Without underestimating the singularity both of content and methodology of each of these works, one can say they are all witness to the same historical skepticism that was ushered in by Goldziher, Lamans, and Caetani, so previous Orientalists at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The above-mentioned researchers, as part of a revisionist approach, wrote a completely different story of Islam's origin from that of traditional Muslim scholarship. They proposed to understand the Quran not on the basis of information from life of Muhammad or from exegetical literature. Rather, they prescribe the use of two dominant methodologies in understanding the Quran, a philological and literary one. These two methodologies follow two iconoclastic hypotheses made about the Muslim traditions. The first was proposed by Günter Lühling and the second by John Wansbrough. The first presupposes the existence of a proto-Quran or ur-Quran. According to this hypothesis, the founding text of Islam reportedly had a primitive form that was issued from pre-Islamic Christian hymnology. This thesis by Günter Lühling is also assumed by Christoph Luxemburg, who in turn emphasized the decisive influence of Syriac liturgy. Another hypothesis, which is markedly different from the first, considers the Quran to be the outcome of a progressive elaboration and integration of multiple sources of prophetic sayings, which took place during a long stretch of time after the death of Muhammad. We know how much of this last approach inspired the audacious hypothesis of Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, and on the basis of which Nebo corroborated his own hypothesis. Being the result of individual initiative, these works have given rise to perplexity, or at times deep hostility. In addition, the numerous and at times irreconcilable divergences on the account of Genesis and history of the Quran have led many specialists to call the contemporary state of Quranic studies as one of confusions, crisis, chaos. However, despite this situation, the present century has seen a renewal in Quranic studies to the point of becoming one of the major fields of contemporary studies on Islam. This vigorous study of the Quran can be illustrated by a significant increase in a number of publications, dissertations, seminars, study projects dedicated to the Quran, prompted by a renewal of sources as well as methodologies for analysis. This growth has led to a hermeneutical debate and redefinition of research topics. I would like now, this is the heart of my presentation, to describe for the public, for our listeners, the golden age of Quranic studies. So means, what is the specificity of the Quranic studies in Western countries, and how we can describe this new golden age, the golden age. Let me start by saying the rapid expansion of Quranic research is most importantly the result of proliferation of sources, be they manuscripts, epigraphs, or less importantly, or archaeological nature. In fact, since the discovery in 1973 of Quranic manuscript, the false sailing of Great Mosque of Sana'a, researchers have been in possession of valuable materials. While no complete edition has yet emerged, some suggestive but fragmentary studies show the indisputable antiquity of these sources. Parallel to the exploitation of manuscripts in Sana'a, one should add the rediscovery of microfilms containing photographs of ancient Quranic manuscripts produced by Godolph Bergstrasse. And according to Claude Gilliot, a specialist of Quranic studies and tafsir, some 9,000 photos of ancient manuscripts of the Quran and around 11,000 photos of books on Quranic disciplines from the first 5 centuries of Hijrah have been compiled by the Commission of the Quran of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, formerly in possession of Anton Spitaler, a specialist of Arabic language, and entrust to Angelika Neuwirth. They are now operated under the Corpus Coranicum project led by the latter. Finally, the recent publication and use of preserved manuscripts should be mentioned, this time in the major European libraries and mainly in framework of the Amari project, another project devoted to analyze the first manuscript of the Quran. One of the most telling examples of the use of manuscript is the reconstruction of François Desroches of the codex named Parisino Petropolitanus, one of that brings copies dispersed mainly in 2 public collections in Paris and in St. Petersburg. Dating back probably to the 1st century of Islam, this manuscript shows the state of the original text of the Quran and the circumstances in which the canonical versions took shape. I would like to emphasize also the more recent work of Asma Ileli, the Sana'a Palimpsest, the transmission of the Quran in the 1st century, which is a very great analysis of the palimpsest, and maybe one of the most important book on recent Quranic studies field. And hopefully she would be invited to present her book. This work, so the work of François Desroches shows the weak position, and also the work of Asmaileli, the weak position from which the idea of a late development of the Quran is defended. In contrast, Asmaileli and François Desroches argues that the written corpus was put together very quickly after the death of Muhammad, and underlines the decisive role of oral transmission. This renewal of resources is not limited to Quranic manuscripts. Medieval texts from Muslim tradition which have been neglected prove crucial for tracing the history of the Quran. I think also of the work of Amir Muazzi from l'École pratique des hautes études in Paris, whose work revolves around the Shia tradition. In a recent book, the author completes our knowledge of the context in which scriptural sources of Islam developed by employing 3 lesser-known works of ancient Shia. Amir Muazzi also shows that the writing of the Quran never took place in a polemical background of warlike position. Similarly, he is of the view that the solicitation of sources outside the Muslim tradition brings about a nuancing or a questioning of the tradition's narratives. Alongside this work on early manuscript research and archaeological surveys in Arabian Peninsula, although recent and excluding the Hijaz region, offers the historian first-order data for understanding the context of Islam's emergence. Excavation of Qariyat al-Faw in the 70s had already revealed the penetration of Hellenic influence to the art of Arabia. Other discoveries, mainly from excavation in Yemen, have revealed to what extent this geographical area has experienced a succession of rich civilizations in the 8th of antiquity. And the work of Christian Robin is also very important to understand the importance of those archaeological findings. But it is without doubt the proliferation of epigraphic discoveries that has had the most spectacular results. Thousands of inscriptions offer information on the linguistic, political, religious, and economic situation that prevailed for more than 2.5 millennia. Among them, numerous inscriptions reveal some original aspect of the early days of Islam and throw light on what Frédéric Imbert has named the Quran's foundation stones. The French expression is le Coran des pierres, and we had already the privilege to listen to him, and I think we have a video about his lecture. In the face of these new sources and the development of humanities, specialists take recourse to state of the heart analysis and techniques, as well as theoretical concept often unheard of. The revival of Quranic studies involves in itself an evolution of uses and methodological tools. I just want to emphasize, so we have new sources, epigraphic new sources, archaeological evidences, and now I would like to emphasize that we have new methodologies to study those new sources. Among those methods used, the codicology is of the most significance. This discipline, as we know, aims at decoding and assessing manuscripts, dating, localization, and evolution. It includes the study of different types of writing in use, their genesis, evolutions, and dissemination. It also seeks to analyze the materials and manufacturing techniques while studying the transmission process of both text and copy centers. In addition, the use of radiocarbon dating and the technique of ultraviolet photography have proven to be very useful A telling example of this contribution of codicology is illustrated in the recent book also of David Powers. In his book, the author examines the meaning of the mysterious word kelela, appearing twice in the Quran, first in chapter 4, verse 12, and again in chapter 4, and Nisa, verse 176. He proposed to solve this problem on the basis of a manuscript review found in the National Library of France, we call it the 328A, 328A, and written in Hijazi script. Paleographic and codicological analysis indicated that the consonantic skeleton, rasm, was revised so that the meaning of the word in the verse had undergone a radical transformation. This is just one instance to illustrate how codicological analysis contributes to the history of the Quranic text, how studying the manuscript can help us to understand the development of the Quran as a manuscript and its history, to trying to write an history of the Mus'haf, to reconstruct a possible history of the Mus'haf. In addition to the advance in our knowledge of historical documentation, contribution by structural analysis allow us to reconsider the formal and compositional singularity of the Quran. The frame of reference considered for the Quran from this approach is no longer diachronic, but synchronic. Analyzing the text as it appears in its final state, many works have used semiotic, narrative, semantic, and rhetorical analysis methods for analyzing the Quran. In this regard, particularly the 12th surah entitled Yusuf was the subject of suggestive studies. So introduction of different methods of analysis has led to use new concept of intertextuality, concept of intratextuality, of metatextuality also. And also, for example, the Contre-discourse, a brief description of this element. It was the topic of my dissertation in my book, Le Contre-discourscoranique, the Contre-discourse in the Quran. And this book apply a method, a linguistic method, to analyze the reported speeches of the opponents in the text of the Quran. Oftenly, the text of the Quran give voices of those opponents by introducing the term, the verb yaquluna, they said, and the text of the Quran replied to them and saying to the Prophet, qul, using reply to those counter-discourse. So new methodologies imply that we see the text of the Quran as a text of literary, trying to consider the text as a literal text, which can be analyzed with new methodologies and new concepts. So those concepts of intertextuality, intratextuality, metatextuality, or contre-discourse. So those methods makes clear the synchronic approach relies exclusively on the recipient of the canonical text. It contrasts clearly with the diachronic approach, which remains true to the historical critical method. This difference causes a reassessment of the question of the meaning of the text, one that involves an hermeneutic analysis. I'm sorry, there is some different terms in this PowerPoint here that I didn't really treat, but I think it's most important maybe to give more time to the hermeneutical reflection and for this presentation. So I will directly and briefly go to my hermeneutical reflections. In the preface to the book, The Quran in Historical Context, which is several contributions, and the editor is Gabriel Reynolds, published in 2005. Daniel Madigan distinguishes two orientations in Quranic criticism. The first is an historical critical approach, which presupposes the possibility to recover the original meaning and intent of the Quran's author, the mens auctoris. On the other hand, the second approach maintains that interpretation is only possible through community of believers, the mens lectoris, who in every age read, reactualize, and update the meaning of the Quran as a canonical text. Since the 80s, these two more or less antagonistic positions have been the subject of a debate between the proponents of a reading of the Quran based on the exegetical literature and other specialists convinced of the potential reconstruction of the original meaning of the text. The latter view was defended by Watt and Bell, who in the 1970s encouraged, I quote, setting aside the views of later Muslim commentators is so far as this appeared to have been influenced by theological developments which came about long after the death of the Prophet, and endeavoring to understand each passage in the sense it had for its first hearers. More recently, to support the contextualization of the Quran, Jacqueline Chaby, a French scholar, historian, proposed to understand the Quran in the context that it was received, the tribal environment that surrounded it, and to which it was addressed. Sorry, it was a quote. So in the, I quote here Jacqueline Chaby, in the context it was received, the tribal environment that surrounded it, and to which it was addressed. Even more recent studies insist on the importance of reading the Quran in light of broader context, that of late antiquity. It is specifically the interaction between para-biblical literature and the Quran that is reconsidered. This research perspective is defended today by Angelika Neuvert in her two recent books and by Gabriel Said Reynolds. While these two authors differed fundamentally on the place given to the chronologic reconstruction of the approach, meaning Quran, the Sirah, sorry, to interpret the Quran, both campaigned to break away from a reading exclusively attached to the Muslim exegetical tradition. In light of these methodological and hermeneutical considerations, several questions and general issues arise, some of which are new to the discussion. First, is it possible to reconstruct the history of the text, and on what terms? How to assess the reliability of Arab sources, which are often contradictory to one another? How to deal with the complexity of the oldest manuscript of the Quran, the text of which vary from, we have to define what means variance, variation between the text. Can we talk about variance in the 7th century? It's a methodological questions that was recently raised by one of our colleagues. How to deal with the complexity of the oldest manuscript? What can we learn from epigraphic sources on the status of the Arabic language of the dawn of Islam? To the above mentioned issues relating to sources inside the Islamic tradition, one should add questions about the alleged context of the emergence of the Quran. Specifically, what is it in the Quran that distinguishes it from the Judeo-Christian tradition? Is it a part of radical singularity or continuity that the Quran must be analyzed, particularly with regard to intertextual methods? Finally, how are we to account for the appropriation of biblical and parabiblical references that occur in the Quran? Finally, how can literary analysis of the Quran help to elucidate the alleged editing work done on the Quranic corpus, that the heterogeneity of the text plead for a variety of sources and contents in the analysis? So does the use of linguistic methods, rhetorical analysis, and analysis of the enunciation, analysis of the rhythm, and poetical nature, contribute to a better understanding of the dynamics and strategies of the Quranic discourse. These multiple issues can only be convincingly, from my point of view, addressed if there are a real and fruitful dialogue between scholars from the Islamic and Western worlds in the coming years. Several factors are already contributing to this. Over the past 2 decades, the publication of works around the Quran is unprecedented, in unprecedented proportion, have provided a rich ground for increasing opportunities for discussions and debate. One of the most sustaining signs of this development is growing implementation of translation from English to Arabic of scientific works written in the West. This moment of translation is largely supported by the immediate and unprecedented access to Islamic knowledge and research through internet networks. A major fact of our time is many websites that offer scientific databases relating to the Quranic text, bibliographical directories where Western production is widely represented, bibliographical and polemical and interreligious studies, works contributing to a wide dissemination of developments in Quranic studies. This partly compensates for the impossibility for a large number of colleagues in Islamic universities to obtain a literature which is sometimes outrageously expensive. Finally, a new generation of students and teachers is emerging, resulting from immigration from various formerly colonized Muslim countries. It greatly facilitates the establishment of initiative and cooperation between Western and Islamic universities, which is a fundamental element. I would like to finish my, if I have some time, Philippe, tell me, 1 minute? Yeah, I just want to emphasize one thing that is really important for me. I think that those approaches, critical approaches on Quranic studies, mainly trying to reconsider the question of context, the contextualization, the text of the Quran, based on a comparison with previous literature from late antiquity, one side, analyzing the text of the Quran by discovering the dynamics of the discourse, so more a structural investigation, but also reflecting the I would say the listeners, how the listener or the reader interact with the text. This intimate relation must be also understand and studied, and also the exegetical investigations, meaning using, of course, the long Islamic tradition. These 3 different poles, I would say, different character of investigation must be in dialogue. I think this is one of the turning point of the Quranic studies nowadays. This is the possibility that those 4 different aspects or 4 different investigation could be in dialogue, could be really a field where they can exchange their point of views. This is, I think, one of the aspects of the turning point of what I call the hermeneutical reflection on the Quran nowadays. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mehdi Azaiez. As we are running out of time, I just leave the floor directly to Dr. Abdullah. Okay, thank you for opening your mic, and thank you for the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mehdi, for this wonderful presentation. Since you were talking about like many different scholarship that is happening in the West, I'd like to know, how would you like to compare? So for the sake of our audience, how would you compare, for example, the kind of Quranic hermeneutical scholarship that is happening in the West with the ones that are happening, for example, by perhaps some Muslims in the Middle East? Like, for example, you did talk a little bit about those scholarship happening in the 19th century as well as the early 20th century, and how then that radically changed by the late 20th century. So when we compare that, for example, with what was happening in the Middle East, like with Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani in the 19th century, Muhammad Abdo, and later on Rashid Rida, Hassan Hanafi, Ismail al-Faruqi, or even the ones that are even in the later part, like the later 20th century, early 21st century, such as, for example, Muhammad Arkoun, Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, Muhammad Shahrour. So how would you compare the differences or the similarities between how the Quranic hermeneutics and the Quranic studies has changed as well in the Middle East?
Thank you for this very important question. I would say, really, first, my attempt here in my presentation is really because they're asking me this to present what's happened in the West, really. But it doesn't mean because I was focusing on the West, it doesn't mean that there's nothing. Of course not. Of course not. So thank you for this question, because it raised a very decisive question. I would say the development of Western investigation on the Quran was already known in Islamic field. There was no, I don't think they were like in ignorance, not at all. And I think that the interaction was always there, always there. And what is painful for me is to see that we didn't maybe enough take into consideration this knowledge and this response already that have been done to the Western research on Quranic studies. And yes, you're right, because I would take an example, because I don't want to be too long, but I would take an example. Muhammad Arkoun, you would say it's French, maybe it's not, Nasr Abu Zaid, sorry, Nasr Abu Zaid, maybe better, if both are important, of course. Nasr Abu Zaid, I mean, Nasr Abu Zaid was trained in Egypt. He had, as you know, he knows Quran by heart, and he's training on hermeneutics and mainly translation in English of Paul Ricoeur's work, influenced heavily his way to understand the text of the Quran. And this is, it was the occasion to implement those hermeneutical tools in his reflection on Quranic studies. So he was able to combine his profound knowledge of Quranic studies, I mean, from the Analytical Reflection, as we find it in Western countries, in Middle East, and combining with the progress of questions of hermeneutics. So already, it's already there. And I would add something also. It has an influence. His reading of the Quran had an influence also on Western scholars who read or study the Quran. So there is a combination, an interaction already on this. There is no two separate words. I don't think so. And Nasr Abu Zaid is a good example to show that. And personally, I am faithful to his approach of the Quran. And it was helping me in my analyzing of the text of the Quran, even for the Contre-discourse. Voilà. This is my answer to your very, very important question.
Well, thank you so much, Mehdi. Well, I know that you did not ignore it. It's just so that I wanted to also have our audience also be aware of that as well.
Of course.
And well, there's a lot has changed in Quranic studies, as you have showed as you have shown in your presentation. And I'd like to ask you, how would that translate to the regular Muslim? Because a lot of it is so academic. Do you think that this is translating somehow to the regular Muslims, or is it just somewhat kind of out of reach from them?
Thank you again for these important questions. I think there is an attempt, and maybe we are here also for that in this exercise, to trying, this is our responsibility also, to implement, to publicize, to inform the public of the development of Quranic studies. And I think it's possible. It's possible for, I think, a simple reason. I mean, internet, social media, with, you know, the problems that can create it also, could be also, it's a tool to put forward those research. It's our responsibility again to make it understandable, and I think there is an intention from both sides to simplify, maybe not simplify, but democratically spread those initiatives. I think, for example, of ICSA, International Quranic Studies Association. This is one of the aspects of this group of scholars to put forward the development of dialogue between scholars, and also to implement it in the public sphere. So yes, definitely, but it's our responsibility, and it's not easy. It's not easy.
Well, thank you so much for that. And also I'd like to ask, especially since you were talking about this dialogue as well, as we know, many people, for example, especially individuals who perhaps, or even scholars who might be a little bit faithful to their faith and their religion, they might sometimes view Western scholars with a bit of skepticism, like having some kind of an Orientalist approach, having an agenda, even if that agenda is perhaps obscured by some kind of secular universities, but still hidden within that, we can see sometimes in some of the works that there is a hidden agenda behind some of those works. How do you feel, because this was very obvious, especially in the 19th century and the early 20th century works on Quranic studies. And as you have showed, you basically showed that this has been changing, especially in the last 2 decades. How do you see what will happen in the next 2 decades? If you're calling this the golden age, are we at the peak already and then we're going to start to go down again? Or how would you see the next couple of decades in Quranic studies?
Well, it depends on many factors, but I think we must be honest with our work. It's not easy. It's not easy, but I think that if we are truthful to clarify methodologies, to explain clearly what is our objectives, what are our methods, and that I think it will clarify and maybe reduce this assumption or this skepticism that we can share, that we can find when we study the text of the Quran. I think we have to be patient, we have to be pedagogical, we have to be truthful to our method and to explain it clearly to everyone. And I think we must accept the times, and we must accept also to be modest, because we don't say that we have the truth. We say we have methods to study the text of the Quran, which much respect for it. And I would say, it's a way to honor the text, to study it. It's an honor to respect it. And I think by clarifying our objectives and our methods, we will be truthful to our mission, I think. And I'm really optimistic. Finally, I'm really optimistic that the Quranic studies will grow because we are in interaction together.
Well, thank you. That's a very beautiful response, because yes, this interaction together, there is an interdisciplinary work that is happening in Quranic studies, especially as you were saying as well, that we have to accept the times. And for example, gender studies in this age is becoming very popular in all over the world. And of course, even within Quranic studies, a lot of feminist interpretations and hermeneutics happening within Quranic studies, such as that done in the West, like for example with Amina Wadud, or even those done by Fatma Mernisi, Haida Mugissi, and others as well. So absolutely. Well, I don't want to take so much time from the audience. I'd like to open the screen, if we can say the floor, but if we can open the screen for our audience to ask questions.
Yeah, maybe I will take the privilege of being the ringmaster today, just to ask you a couple of questions to Mehdi and Dr. Abdullah, and after I will leave the floor. As a historian, I was just wondering, while listening to you, Mehdi, if we were not moving actually from a kind of historical approach to the Quran and challenges to a kind of anthropological approach, which is a kind of giving up the idea of building a critical edition of the Quran and things like that, and moving to something which is more anthropological. Well, it was just a feeling that I had while listening to you. And this is a question to you and maybe to Dr. Abdullah, because Dr. Abdullah, this is my second question. I've not been able to find your own approach in what Mehdi has described. And so I would like you just to give us a few words about your own work, which is, as Mehdi said, and as I felt while researching about you, quite unique actually in the Gulf and in the whole Quranic studies. So if you would just have a couple of minutes, and after we leave the floor to the other question, which are many.
Okay, I just want to answer to the question of anthropology. Well, the approach of anthropology is not so developed nowadays. The only person who can approach to this methods would be Jacqueline Chaby, the French historian, who tried to understand the text of the Quran based on her understanding of what was the context of the first listeners. And she tried to reconstruct this specific space of Arabia by analyzing the lexicographic meaning, the meanings of words, what she called the material meanings of the words. So linked to this very specific space of Arabia. And this is maybe the first attempt, I think, of an anthropological, historical approach of the text of the Quran. Jacqueline Chaby called it was translated in Arabic recently in Lebanon. Her book entitled in French was Le Seigneur des Tribus. It was an anthropological approach, as she put forward. Abdullah, maybe you want to answer to the questions of Philippe.
Thank you. Well, to answer Philippe's second question about my approach towards Quranic hermeneutics, well, I use what I call intertextual polysemy, and it's looking into the words, the semantics of those words, because usually in Semitic languages, including Arabic, one word has many different meanings, but they're usually related with one another. And so I look into how, for example, the Quran intratextually, so how the Quran uses certain terms in different passages to see if there are some kind of intra-allusions, so intra-Quranic allusions. So if certain passages of the Quran are alluding to other passages of the Quran, or also intertextually, meaning how the Quran sometimes alludes to passages from biblical literature, from rabbinic literature, for example. And so this is the method I use. And what I argue is looking into perhaps something a little bit controversial, but looking into a psychological perspective, because an author who would be able to do something like that, in which they will be able to see, for example, how words can merge with each other and do these kinds of intertextualities and this web of intertextualities with parallel language, such as parallel terms, parallel themes, parallel contexts, and so forth. We must understand, of course, the authorial intent. And the authorial intent is best understood if we understand the psychology of perhaps the person who was writing the Quran. And that is why I do delve a little bit with the psychology of Muhammad and what perhaps was going on in his mind as he was trying to convey the message of the Quran. So as you said, it is somewhat unique, but it's not too unique, because at the end of the day, whatever document we have from any literature, the best way to understand what the author intended to say is to understand, of course, the psychological motivation behind it. Because we all know, of course, personalities play a huge role on how we convey different messages. And so if you understand the personality and what was going on in the mind of the person conveying the Quran, for example, then we would perhaps better understand the message of the Quran.
Thank you very much. We will now begin the question with Orhan Almaz. I don't know if you can open your mic so that you can ask your question.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hi. How
Yeah.
are you? Thank you very much for organizing this talk, and thank you very much for talking, Mehdi.
Thank you, Anwar. It's a great pleasure to have you again, because it makes maybe 6 years I didn't see him. Didn't see you.
Yeah, it's been quite a few years.
Yeah.
You have made a great effort, definitely, in showing all the everything that has basically happened in summative form to an audience that might not be as familiar with Quranic studies in the Western context, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think for some of the audience, even epigraphical results might be completely new, and we're by far not done with epigraphy. I mean, ancient North Arabian is just starting in comparison to ancient South Arabian epigraphy. And I think it was also great that you showed the corpus Quranicum and how a critical edition is being developed, as well as a digitization of all the various readings of the Quran. However, what I would like from you is to share with us your view on new approaches, that is hermeneutical as well as methodological approaches, and kind of outline ways in which we can further Quranic studies in the 21st century with everything that is available to us.
Yeah. Do you mean that I have to choose one?
No.
No, it was a joke. I think what is interesting, I see hermeneutics on the Quran, maybe in too simple way. I think that we have 3 different ways to read the text of the Quran, if I put it very quickly. First, you can focus on the author, on the context of the text of the Quran, context of the text of the Quran. We have a second possibility is to focus on the text. So the development of structural, enunciation, rhetorical strategies, etc. So the text, and only the text. And the third possibility is to focus on the listeners. What's happening when you read the text of the Quran? What is the relation you have with it? And it was mostly developed by, I would say, the names, I'm sorry, I forget the names. But keep in mind these 3 different ways. The authors, context, second, the text itself, and third, the listener. So 3 different, I would say, actors. And I think that the new way we can focus on one aspect. I think that nowadays, what is the turning point is that we have the possibility to combine these 3 approaches. And to add a 4th element, which is fundamental for me, is to add, of course, the polyphony of Islamic legacy. So it means that the different readings of the text of the Quran. So we have, I would say, 4 different actors in the field of hermeneutics. And I think what is interesting, what could be really exciting for the future, is trying to think about the condition of a dialogue between those different aspects, different investigation. This is what I'm trying to think, the conditions of a dialogue, a constructive dialogue. It doesn't mean that you have to be, you have to agree on the different ways, on different methodologies, but to see how those four elements could be in dialogue, could speak together with respect to each other, and maybe the most important thing, to recognize there may be interesting way to read the text or to interact with the text. This is how I feel the question. This is my answer to your question. Hopefully I answer to it a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Orhan. Okay, thank you for sharing your mic. And Basma Al-Ubaid had 3 questions, I think. We just got it through email, by email.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, Basma, can you hear us and can you speak, or do you want me to read your question?
Yeah, hello.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the voice, but because there's a lot of dust here in Kuwait, there's a problem for me speaking. So it's better for you if you just read what I send in the email, please.
Yeah. If you want,
I will read it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard for me to talk now.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. No problem. The first question you asked by email was, as a historical view of the Quranic text interpretation through the past century or eras, what do you believe were the main factors that influence these interpretations, and how the text was comprehended, understood in a specific period of time and in a specific location? And you gave the example of, like, was it the political perceptions of people in power at the time, geosecurity situation, psychology of the masses, etc. The second question, the Austrian. When studying the religious texts and manuscripts related to Islam, looking at the interpretation and explanation of the aforementioned, especially at the early period of Islam, do you take into consideration that many, if not all, of the version of Quranic interpretation have embraced this new religion during their adult years, having accumulated beliefs and traditions from other religions or other faiths? And is it easy for a scholar like you to distinguish between the authentic meaning of the verse and the influence of other religions and cultures? And does this issue have a significant effect on how we perceive Islam today? The third and last question is, nowadays, do you feel that people are more accepting and open to challenging their inherited body of religious beliefs, or do you observe a resistance or regression in their approbation in favor of orthodoxical understanding? And how would you judge this impact on the subject?
Okay, thank you so much, Asma, for those questions. I would try to do my best to answer to your question. So, as an historical view of the Quranic text through the past, what are the main factors? I think what is very important to understand is that meanings of the text of the Quran are not one. I mean, Islam is a polyphony of interpretations, and it's a polyphony because there is different factors in each context where the Muslim actualize the meaning. So producing meanings imply different actors, different space, different languages. There is different factors, and it would be very difficult to define all of them. But yes, it's a complex diversity of factors that contribute to many different interpretation of the Quran. Is there one specifically more important than other? It would be difficult to answer to this question. There is political, sociological, economical also. We can imagine also the impact of those different questions in the interpretations with a big S of the text of the Quran. This is my answer for the first question, but Abdullah, if you want to answer after me, please go ahead. Your second question, Explanation, I'm just rereading it. Well, I have always a problem with the question of what is the authentic meaning of the text of the Quran, or the authentic meaning of the verse. As an historian, I can't answer to this question. I mean, for me, there is no, I cannot answer to the question of what is the authentic meaning of the verse. I would say it's not my job as an historian. I can have a personal view of this question, but as a scholar, I can't answer to this question. And of course, producing meanings of the text of the Quran through history was influenced by other religions and other cultures. Of course, how the Muslims have understood the text through history was also influenced by their relation with other civilization and other culture. It's obvious. This is my answer for your second question. And the third question, I would say that, I mean, I had the chance to give lectures all around the world, in Arabic countries, but also in Western countries. Well, I found always open hearers, open-minded people who accept to listen to an historical approach of the text of the Quran, mainly, of course, mainly. I think people are more and more open to consider the text with much respect of the text, of course, to consider positively the historical approach or the structural approach to study the text of the Quran. This is my answer. Please, Abdullah, maybe you can add with your wise and clever approach also your point of view on those questions. And thank you again, Esma, for your questions. Thank you again.
You've done a wonderful job, Mehdi, to respond to this question. And I think actually, like in regards to other civilizations and other cultures and their influence in the Quran, I think scholars today do recognize that the Quran, for example, is in conversation with many different audiences. And it's not just simply the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, or the community of believers, and the non-believers. The non-believers today, we as scholars, we also recognize they're not monolithic. So when the Quran is speaking also, for example, to some of the pre-Islamic Arabs, we shouldn't also simply say that all the pre-Islamic Arabs believed in the same thing, they were all worshipping idols or something like that, because they themselves were also had plurality in beliefs. They had many different beliefs, many different understandings, and perhaps the Quran is in conversation with several communities who were neither, of course, the community of the believers, who were neither Christian nor Jews. And even within Christianity, when the Quran, for example, also is in conversation with Christians, we shouldn't also expect that the Quran is always in discussion with a single Christian community, because there were so many Christian communities in the 7th century. There were many different influences. We had the Ethiopic church, of course, and the Quran gives us some clues that it is aware of the Ethiopic church. It gives us some clues that the Quran is aware of the Syriac church. Also from within the Muslim tradition, it seems that the Quran is also aware, perhaps somewhat, or at least during the time of the Prophet, he was aware also of the Coptic church, which is a non-Chalcedonian Christology, which is very different, for example, than the Eastern Orthodox or the Catholic churches, which of course later on they diverged from one another. But it was also different. But it seems that the community at the time was also aware of the Orthodox, of the Coptic church. For example, one of the Prophet's wives is assumed to be a Copt. And also, it seems also from the Muslim tradition that at the time, in the 7th century, they were also aware of the Arian Christology and the Arians, because, for example, in the letter that the Prophet Muhammad had sent to Byzantium, in that letter, he said that, well, if you don't heed to those words, then onto you will be the sin of the Arians. So what does that mean? Of course, is open to debate, scholarly speaking, but that also tells us that the community at the time were also aware of Aryan Christology. So there were so many different Christian communities. So we cannot even also assume that when the Quran is conversing about Christian beliefs, it's speaking about Christianity as a monolithic belief. But it must also mean that we must really recognize the plurality and the differences of all the different communities that existed in which the Quran was in conversation with. So yeah, that's the only thing I'd like to add. So thank you so much, Basma. It's a very important question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you again, also Abdullah.
I'm sorry that I have to conclude because I have to stand by my commitments to organize short sessions, and we are now over 1 hour. But well, it was really inspiring and very exciting. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah, for your comments and discussion and being with us today. I know this is a particular day for the Emirates, so thank you for staying with us. And thank you, Dr. Mehdi, for accepting this lecture and having made, I think, a great effort to synthesize and simplify a field which seems to be very, very complex. And so many thanks to you, many thanks for everybody. And I think we will meet for our next lecture on the April 11th. And it will be about Islamic philosophy and the CEFREPA lecture series. So thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Abdullah. It was a great
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mehdi, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
So gentle.